What's up YouTube, this is Dennis Panuta for tutorials.eu. In this video I've got a golden nugget for you because we are going to cover SQLite in depth. This is going to be a 1-hour course on SQLite, so how to use databases in Android and using Android Studio to get even more information about the data that you have in your database. So you're going to see a bunch of good tricks that are going to help you to become better at understanding databases and also at using them, or at least at using SQLite, which is a very lightweight database kind of structure that is a database directly on the phone itself, on which the application will be installed in the end. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and please make sure to hit that like button and also leave a comment, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button as well, because I promise you, you'll get a lot of value from this video. It's, by the way, part of my complete Android masterclass. You can find a link in the description below where you will learn how to use what you're learning in this video to build full applications. All right, so let's dive into the video. Alrighty, welcome back. In this video, we are going to check out SQLite, or better said, in this video, we are going to check out the preparation for the SQLite demo, which will be in the next video, because I have this little application here, which I prepared, and you can see what it does. So let's have a look at it first, and then let's see how it's built from a structural perspective, so from an UI perspective, and then we are going to look at the database specifics, because what we are using here is an item adapter, which is again a recycler view adapter. So we have seen recycler views before, and we're also using pop-ups here, or dialogs, custom dialogs, which are going to be created. So let's look at this. We have this little application. I called it SQLite demo, but what it really does is it stores employee data. So we have the name and the email ID of that employee. So I'm just going to enter something here. So my name is Dennis Panuta and my email address will be test@test.com. And once I click on this add record button, it will be there. So this entry is here now. In order to test whether it's actually permanent, let's close the application and let's run it again, because that way we can check if the entry is actually permanent. And there we are. So the entry is permanent. Now you can see this is the line where we see the name, the email address, and then we have two buttons here. So this one is edit, and we can update a record, and this one is delete, and we can delete a record. So first let's update a record, and here I'm going to change the name to, let's say, .uk, and then I press update, and let's see, okay, it's updated here. And now let's close the application again just to see if that actually has a permanent effect. And there we are. So it does have a permanent effect here, and we can add more records. It cannot be blank, so let's just enter something in here, add this record, and you can see we are using a very basic functionality here. We don't check whether the email address is a correct email address from its format perspective and so forth, but we're just entering stuff in there. Okay, so you can see now we have this list of elements, and if we enter a bunch of entries in here, it's going to still work perfectly. So let me add even more, just so that we have enough entries. Actually, I need the name here. So just we have enough entries so that we can scroll here. So you can see this is a list view here at the bottom, which is a recycler view to be more precise. And we have a bunch of entries. Now we can delete them, and this screen pops up. So you can see I usually want to delete it. I'm going to say yes, and it's gone. So you can see we have two different types of dialogues. One is for the confirmation when we delete something, and the other one is in order to edit a record. All right, so update a record, updating it. You can see record updated. So a bunch of code surrounding the actual fundamentals of SQLite that I want to teach you. But I still think that this is a great demo that you can use whenever you need the code, because this was just plainly the CRUD operations. CRUD standing for create, read, update, and delete. And these are the things that you are going to require throughout your career, at least if you want to be a developer, right? Because you will need to do these things regularly. That's why This demo will be amazing for your purposes. You will just be able to reuse the code from here and apply it for your examples. So let's look at the surrounding things first before we look into the database handler and into how the database stuff itself works. Therefore, we need to look at the layout first. So we can see the layout is generally a toolbar and an include. So include is content main, and in the content main, that's where we do all of this name row. So then the actual text field for the name, the text view, and an edit text. So text view, edit text. Text view is just the visible text, so to speak, and the edit text is the actual field which you can edit the text in. And then we have an add record button, or just a button which says add record, and once we click that, well, it will add something to the list, which then will be updating the list view that we have here at the bottom, which is a recycler view. All right, so next thing is the items row. Let's look at the individual items that we have here. So we have a TV name, so text view name, then just a text view, didn't give it a proper name, it's just an empty space in between. Then the text view, which is just a colon, very basic. Then TV email, which is the email address. And then we have this IV edit, which stands for image view edit and image view delete. So if you want to see it in code, well, you can download it, but you can see we have 3 text views, then we have an image view and another image view, which contain these beautiful little buttons, and they have IDs so that we can talk to them via code. Then we have this dialog update, which is our custom dialog, which we use in order to update a record. There we have simply the update record text, then again a text view and a text field, or an edit text, so to speak. And then here we have a linear layout where update and cancel are all the way up to the right. You can see it's TV, so text views, and this is the code. Well, you can download the code anyways, right? But what's interesting here is that we are using linear layout and the gravity is towards end. And as far as I know, we have not used end yet, which just means that we position stuff towards the right. Okay. And of course, this is not this field here, but it's actually when we edit these 2 text fields, which are positioned towards the right. That's what happens via gravity end. All right, the next thing that we should look at is the item adapter. So here we are using an item adapter, and you should check out the adapter, or in general the recycler view video, the recycler view demo, if you want to understand better what's going on here. But basically we are inheriting from a recycler view adapter, and we're creating an item adapter which requires a context and an array list of a class which I called EMP model class. We're going to look at that later on. And then we have the onCreate view holder, which we override, and here we just inflate the individual item row. Then we have the onBind view holder, where we bind every individual line with the correct name and email, which means every single entry that we have here will be updated, at least the name and email will be updated. And you can also see that the colors are changing. So every second one is gray, every second one is white. That's what happens with these 2 lines of code. Then we have this holder with set on click listener. So we have inside of our holder, which is this one here, the view holder. Now, if you want to know more about the view holder, you can check out the class. Maybe we should do that now first. So we have this view holder, which inherits from view holder of recycler view. And in there, I have 5 properties, or variables, so to speak. And one of them is the linear layout main, the text view name, text view email, text view edit, and IV delete. So linear layout main is going to be the whole row here. Well, at least the linear layout with the whole row. And as you can see, we have a text view name, text view email, text view edit button, and text view delete button. And all of them are inside of this view holder. And well, we need them in order to access those. So if I want to, for example, change the text of one of the items, well, I can see, I can read the item name and actually change our view there, our text view name, text. The same goes for the email address. Then for the color, well, the changing them, and then we have the IV edit, which is our image view edit. Once we click on that, which just means this button here, once we click on this button, we want to call the context update record dialog item. And inside of context, well, what is context? Context is main activity. So inside of main activity, we have this method called update record dialog. And we will look at that later on because here a bunch of stuff is going on. So that's why I want to do it in the next video. Then we have IV delete, which simply calls the delete record alert dialog, and that will then delete it. And of course, as always, we override the get item count. So it's the general approach that we have seen in the demo as well. There's not much difference except for that we're talking to multiple items now instead of just one item within our list element. So within an individual list item. But other than that, this recycler view is pretty much the same. All right, so this was the preparation. And I would say in the next video, we are going to check out our main activity, our EMP model class, which is very basic, and our database handler, which is not so basic. That's why I'd say we cut it down into multiple videos. So see you in the next video, and make sure that you understand the stuff that I explained in this video, because this is really just repeating what we have learned so far, because it will make things easier once we actually go to the next video. So see you there. Quick pause. So you're learning something about Android in this video, and I hope you enjoy it. If you want to learn everything that you need to know to become a real Android developer, then definitely check out my Android Masterclass, because in this course, you're going to build a bunch of great applications along your journey to becoming an Android developer. First, you're going to learn the Kotlin basics. Then you're going to learn to build one app after another. And while you do that, you get a bunch of demos which will really dig deep into the concepts, as well as presentations which will help you to understand what you're learning. So don't miss out and get the course right now. You can find the link in the description below. Now that you understand the basic structure of this demo, the SQLite demo, let's look into the SQL part of it, because we actually want to use it later on, and you will need it in many applications. Each time that you want to store something permanently on your device, then it really makes sense to use this. Okay, use SQLite, because it's a lightweight, super powerful tool in order to store data permanently. So the first thing that I did is I created a model class, so a data model class, which is a very generic thing. You can see here, it's just a class called EMP model class. So EMP standing for employee. And what it contains is an ID, a name, and an email. And the ID is an integer, name is a string, email is a string. And we're going to use that class model because the idea behind this data model class is it doesn't have any methods. It's really just super simple. It's really just saying, okay, if we create an object of this class, then it should contain these three values and properties, so to speak. Okay, so what we can go next to is our database handler. So I have this other class here called database handler, and that one is taking care of the whole database stuff. So we have this database handler, which is just our own way of implementing a SQLite Open Helper. So this is the SQLite Open Helper class, which we inherit from. This is a class that exists in Android, and we just go ahead and create our own version of it. We adjust it to our needs. And you could see you need a context, a database, a factory, which can be null, and a database version when creating such an object. Now, the companion object is something that we use in order to create constants. And especially the main idea is to create static variables which are available throughout the application, and we make them constant by using this const keyword. So it's values, and we use these capital letters. This is an indication that something is constant. even though the database version might change, but it will only change when we develop it. So we as a developer are the only one changing it. It's not going to change during runtime. That's why it is okay to leave it as a constant. Now, what is the database version? Well, a database version is the version of the database, and when you want to change the database, meaning that you want to add another column to the database, then you would also have to update the database. So you have to change the version of the database. So in our example, in our database, we only have 3 entries. One of them being the ID. We don't see the ID in our UI. The other one being the name, and the third one being the email. Now let's say we would like to add another column, so a 4th column being the age. If we add another column to the database, we also need to update the code in our code here, and we need to let our application know that we are using a new database version, because otherwise we could break the data, because it's expecting only an ID, a name, and an email, but it's suddenly also getting another value which it doesn't know what to do with. So it's important to version your databases. Okay, then we have the database name, and that is the overall name. And within a database, you can have a bunch of tables. And we are just using one table for now. So the database is the whole thing containing potentially a bunch of tables, thousands of them if necessary. And we are using one table for now, which is the table called contacts. So we use employee table as the table name here. And then we have a private const value key underscore ID. And this one has an underscore underneath it when giving it a name. What this indicates, or what we use this for, is as the primary key. Now, what is a primary key, you might ask? Well, it's a primary keyword is a key in a relational database that is unique for each record. This means that there is no way that an ID, so the same number, so to speak, will appear twice or even more times. Each of the IDs is unique. So when we look at our entry again, so in our database here, so we have an entry. This is entry number 1. It will probably have the ID 0. We can start with any value that we want, but it makes sense to start with 0. So the first entry will have an ID of 0. The second entry will have an ID of 1. This one will have an ID of 2, and this one will have an ID of 3. Okay, now in order to make it a little simpler, let's change those names actually. Let's change the name to this one being 0, then this one being 1, this one being 2, and then the next entry being 3. Okay, so I'm trying to keep it super simple here. In this example, what I want to do with this is to demonstrate you the uniqueness of this key, of this primary key. So let's say we have this entry 0, which is test.uk, and this is our ID 0. Then the next entry is ID 1, and this one is ID 2, and so forth. So each time we create a new entry, it will get a new ID, and each ID will be unique. Okay, so let's say I delete this entry here, the entry with the ID 1. It doesn't mean that once I create the next entry, it will automatically be ID 1 and it will fill the gap, so to speak. And it doesn't also mean that this 2 will suddenly become number 1 and just everything will be pushed to the top. No, that's not what happens. Every single object that is created, so every entry in our database that is created, will get the next ID. So the next one that was ever used. So if we had 13 entries at one point, and even if we deleted 10 of them, the next entry that will come will then have an ID of 13 or 14, whatever you want to start with. So if we start with 0, then it would be 13 because we have 13 entries before starting at 0. So the latest ID number will be 12. So the next entry would then be 13. Okay, so I hope this didn't confuse you, but just memorize this. A primary key is a unique identifier, which means it only exists once. If you want to know more about this whole stuff, then definitely check out Google on that. I don't want to go too deep into databases and how they work on a super deep level. All right, so that's the main thing that you should remember. Unique identifier, so the key ID is unique. Then coming back to our code, so we have also the name and an email for our user. Now let's see what onCreate does. Well, onCreate is called, and we had onCreate before, but we had it for activities, but onCreate also exists for databases. So it will be called once the database is created. So what we do here is we say we want to create a contacts table. So we create a new table and we create the table like this. So you can see create table, table context, then opening bracket, key ID as the integer primary key with the key name called text and the key email called text. And you can see that this is, so to speak, a super long string. And a lot of things could go wrong here. So you have to be very, very precise when writing such a string, because this is an actual SQL instruction. And it generally works like this. When you want to create a new table, you start with a keyword called create table. Then you have an empty space. Then you have the name of the table that you want to use. And I use the table context name, which means employee table. And it's important that there is no empty space, neither at the beginning nor at the end, because we do the empty spaces in here already, if they are required. Okay, then the next one is we open the bracket, and in there we add the key ID, which is our underscore ID, empty space, integer, which indicates what type it is. And what's important, in databases, the data types are not the same as they are in Kotlin or in other programming languages. So integer, it doesn't say int as we would do in Kotlin. It actually is integer. Then there is this keyword primary key, and that's important. So we have empty space primary, empty space key. By this we say that this key ID will be our primary key. Then we add a comma. We add the next column name, so to speak, because this is the first column name. Then comes the second column name, which is our key name, and it is of type text. And then we have the third column name, which is again separated by a comma, which is our text here. So, which is the key email. So written in a normal language without all of these different variables that we're using, what is written here is create a table called employee table, and then in brackets you add all of the columns. So column number 1 is called ID. It's of type integer, and it's going to be our primary key, so this is going to be unique. Then we say name text, which is the second column, and it's called name, and it's going to be of type text. Then we have email, which is of type text. So this will be our table that we create. So now when we create this table, it will have these columns. It will have the column underscore ID, it will have the column name, and it will have the column email. And now if you create an entry, ID will be automatically incremented. So it will start at 0, and each time that you create a new entry, it will automatically increment the ID and it will create a new entry. So now let's say we create a third entry here, and we call this one Frank the Tank, and we have his email, which is frank@thetank.com. And now we decide to get rid of this guy, or let's say rid of Marie Curie, who invented or found out that there was a lot of radiation coming around, or floating around. So now let's say we delete Marie Curie, and now we create a new entry, and it will again be the next ID. So it will not start, or it will not be put here on the 2, but it will actually go to the next value. So it now will be 4, the next integer, so to speak, and so forth. So that's what this whole primary key stuff means. And that's also what we're doing with this table here, our create table. Okay, So now, once we created or prepared an SQL command, which this is, so this here is a SQL command, we can execute it. So what we're doing is, in onCreate, we say, please go ahead, execute a SQL command, which is this command that we stored in create context table. Of course, you could have passed this whole thing directly in here, but then it would be super difficult to read. And I think it's a little easier to read it like this. By the way, if you want to know more about the data types in SQL, you should definitely check out SQLite.org. And here, SQLite version 3, there you will see that there is null, well, empty, we've seen that. Integer, real is a floating point value. Then text is just some simple text, and blob is the value, is a blob of data stored exactly as it was input. So this is something that is then transferred into a data type, which is something that we have seen when we created an image out of our drawing. You might remember in the drawing app where we drew an image on the view and then we created a PNG out of it. Well, while we did that, we had that data floating around in a byte-sized or in a byte format, so to speak. And that's what pretty much blob allows as well. So that, for example, if you have a PNG, then it will store that as a PNG. If you have it as a Excel file, then it will store it as an Excel file and so forth. So if you want to know more about it, you should check it out here. You can also see the limitations of those. For example, if you want to store date times, then you can use it as a text using the ISO 8601. So you could store a date like this, or you could use it as a real value or as an integer. So you have a bunch of options here. By the way, here Boolean data types are stored as 0 for false and 1 for true. So there is no need for an additional data type just for that. All right, so that's what happens in the onCreate. Now I'd say this video is long enough, and I wasn't even expecting for this to be done within one video. So I'd say let's go to the next video where we're going to look at onUpgrade and all of the methods that I created myself in order to make this database work. So see you in the next one. Quick pause. So you're learning something about Android in this video, and I hope you enjoy it. If you want to learn everything that you need to know to become a real Android developer, then definitely check out my Android Masterclass, because in this course, you're going to build a bunch of great applications along your journey to becoming an Android developer. First, you're going to learn the Kotlin basics. Then you're going to learn to build one app after another. And while you do that, you get a bunch of demos which will really dig deep into the concepts, as well as presentations which will help you to understand what you're learning. So don't miss out and get the course right now. You can find the link in the description below. Welcome back. In the last video, we saw how to create a table in our database, which was this create context table, how I called it. And it's just this SQL command that we are executing in this line. And the command reads like this. So what it does, it just creates a table with 3 columns, of which one being the key, which is the ID, and that will be the primary key, which will auto increment. All right, so then we have this onUpgrade method, which is called when we upgrade our table, which means, for example, if we add another column and then we want to change the way our database table looks like, then we would need to let our app know that we are now working with a new version of the database, because now it's not having 3 columns anymore, but it also has a 4th column, for example, the age, and then we would need to update it. So for example, if we'd go ahead and say, okay, I want to have a key called age in here as well, then I would need to update my database version. But I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to keep it simple for now. So the next thing is our fun add employee. So this is a method that is not inside of the standard SQLite Open Helper class, but it's code that is created by us, so custom code. And what we have here is that we want to add an employee. So how do we add an employee? Well, we want to have a EMP, which stands for Employee Model Class Object, and it will return a long. So what does it do? Well, first of all, we need to have a database, and in order to get the database that we want to write on, we can use this .writable database. So a database that we can write on, and this meaning in the context of in which we are, and we are in the context of our database helper. Then we need a bunch of content values that we want to put onto this database. So what we do is we create this content values variable, which we then put the values in. So for example, I put the key name and the AMP name into this content values container, so to speak. So you could imagine it like a container, and you fill it up with all of the information that you have, and once you're done with filling it up, you add that to the database. So what I'm saying is, please go ahead and add a new entry for the name and the following email, and then insert that into the database. And we store the result in this variable called success. So success will return a long value. So here, a long value. So this db insert, with this method we say, please insert into the table called table context, with the null column hack being null, so we don't pass any value here. Pass the content values there, please. So just write whatever we had in the content values onto the table. So just add a new entry, a new line, so to speak, in this table called table context. And then we close this database because we opened it at one point. We started to write into it. Then we need to close it. We need to close the connection. And then we return the success value. So if it worked or it didn't work, but it's not a Boolean, it's actually a long because we are returning a long here. And well, because insert returns a long. So if you look at it, it's a Java method. As you can see here, public long insert, so it returns a long, and if things go wrong, it will return -1, and otherwise it will return the insert with config. So if you want to know more about it, you would need to go deeper and see what this method does and so forth. But generally speaking, what we do with this is we just store that in the table, and if things go wrong, then the return value will not be positive, but it will be -1. Okay, so this is how we can add data to our database with this approach that you can see here. So we need to get the database, then we create an object of content values, we put the column information that we want to add, so name and email. As you can see, there is no ID. I'm not explicitly adding the ID, even though it's part of our table here, key ID, and that is because it's not necessary, because the ID is a primary key, and it will auto increment. Each time that we add a new entry, it will automatically increase by 1. So how do we read data from the table? Well, I have this view employee method, and what I get is an array list of EMP model class object as a result of it. So that will be returned from it. And that's the cool thing, because we don't need to go ahead and create maps and use maps here, but we just have our own model that we created, which is this EMP model class, where we just have the 3 names of the columns. So if we want to have more names in here, we could go ahead and create a new value called age, which is of type integer, for example. Of course, if we do so, we also need to be careful and need to put that into our table description, which is in our database handler. But basically you can see we can use this class, EMP model class, so this model, in order to use it very quickly. So we had that here before. When adding an employee, we also just pass in a whole object of EMP model class. So we don't need to specifically add in a name, then an email and so forth, but we're just passing the whole object. And now it's the same thing here. We are, when we're viewing the employees, returning or getting a bunch of EMP model class objects. So a bunch of employees. So then we go ahead and we create a new value, an employee list, which is of type array list, which contains employee model class objects. So here, emp model class objects. And then we use the select keyword. So what we're doing here is we are running a select query. With a select query, we can select data from a table. So we are saying here, select star or asterisk from this table called table context. So what we say is just give me everything that you have in this table. All the rows that are in the table, all the columns, give me all the data that is in there. So that's what our select query does here. And then we need the database again. And this time it's not a writable database, but we just need the readable database. And here is something that we have to use when running through a database. So we need a cursor. So the cursor, it starts at null, or it is null at the start. And then what we try is we try to fill the cursor with a raw query, which is going to run the select query, this one, onto our database. And we said that we don't want to have any specific selection arguments that we also pass in here. So then what we're just trying is to execute our query here. And if that didn't work with this raw query, then we just say, okay, execute a SQL query. And that will then select the SQL query. So we have this try, we try this code, and if it doesn't work, so something goes wrong, then we catch the code, we run the execute SQL with the select query, so select star from table context, and then we return an array list here. All right, the next thing I do is I take this var ID, which is of type integer, so I create the variables here for the different columns, the ID of type integer, the name of type string, and the email of type string, so the same formats that we had before, and also the same that we have here in our employee model class. And then I move through the cursor. So here I tried to get the cursor, so to set the cursor, so to speak, and then I move it through the cursor. And I have a do while loop here, which moves to the next entry as long as there are next entries. So going back to our example here, in our table, it starts here at this element, and then it moves through the cursor. Just goes through the whole table. And every single time that it does that, what we want to have is we want to get the ID from the entry of the cursor, so from the table, so to speak. We want the name and we want the email address. And then we want to create an employee object out of that. So an employee model class object out of the information that we read from the table. And we store that in a new list here, or in our employee list. So we add that to our employee list, which is this array list of employee model class objects. And once all of that is done, we'll return this employee list. So our function, which was supposed to return an array list of employee model classes, is going to do that. And here, by the way, this cursor has a function for getInt, which will get the cursor's column index at the key ID, then the column index at the key name, and the column index at the key email. So coming back to our table here, let's say we are at this cursor row. Then for the ID, it's going to check this and it's going to store it in here. Then it checks the column name key name. So it goes here to name where with Frank Einstein. And then we have the email, bam, email frank@einstein.com. Okay, so that is what it's going to do. And then it's going to store them in EMP, and we store it in our list and return that list. Okay, so that's how you can read from a list. So we're viewing the employee list in our example. Now from the CRUD operations, we had so far create and read. So What is left? Well, the update and the delete functionality. So let's look at the update functionality. Here again, if you want to update, it's the same as if you're writing, so as if you're creating something. So we're using the same approach. We use a database object, which is a writable database. Then we use content value here, the content values object, in order to put the data that we want to put in there. And then we use the update method in the table context, content values, where clause key ID is equal to emp ID. And then you have some where arguments. So what does that mean? Let's look at this update employee once again. What we're saying is, please, when you call this method, give us the employee object that you want to update. And I will return an integer once you've done that. So the employee object, we look at that, we get its name, we get its email, and we change those values. But then we also need to know at which ID we need to update it. So here in our example, at which ID do you want to update the name? So do you want to update it, for example, for our 3, where you now change Frank the Tank to Frank the Gank? Then you could do that by updating this whole object and passing that object, but you need to know the ID, because maybe there is another Frank the Tank. So this is not the only Frank the Tank out there. Maybe there is another entry for Frank the Tank. So we have this employee Frank the Tank twice in our company for some reason, whatever reason that might be, maybe an error, maybe not. And his email is even the same. So he's using the same email address, or maybe we don't have the correct email address of him or something like that. And now we would like to update that. But then we need to know which of the IDs we need to change, because just knowing we need to update Frank the Tank is not going to cut it, because we have Frank the Tank twice. So we need to have his ID in order to update the correct one. And that's where this where clause comes in. So we say the key ID should be the employee ID that is passed to us. So this employee object that is passed to the update method when we call it. Okay, so that's what we update, and then we close the database, and then we return success, which is of type integer. All right, and now the final entry here is delete employee. So how do we delete an employee? Well, again, we need to say which employee we want to delete. So which employee object we want to delete. We have again a writable database, so we are changing something in the database, and each time you want to change something in the database, you need to have a writable database. If you just want to read something in the database, then a readable database is enough, but otherwise you need a writable database. So for creating, updating, and deleting, you will need a writable database, and for reading, you will need a readable database. So here you have the same concept. You have the content values, but now you just say which ID you want to delete. So content values put key ID ID. So now we know which content value we need to update. So we run our database delete method this time. We need to say in which table we want to delete something. Then we need to say at which key ID we want to delete something. And we say at the employee ID. And the where arguments, we set that to null again. So we don't pass any additional information there. Then we close the database and we return whatever success was. So success doesn't necessarily mean that it was successful or not, but it's just what we are returning here, which is of type integer. All right, so that's our database handler. And we looked into it in a lot of depth, but now let's go to the main activity. And in order to do so, I'd say we make a little break and we come back with a lot of new energy and force and will in order to finalize this example. Because as you know, this is a pretty advanced example that we have here, and we are going to require that for future projects. So see you in the next video. Quick pause. So you're learning something about Android in this video, and I hope you enjoy it. If you want to learn everything that you need to know to become a real Android developer, then definitely check out my Android Masterclass, because in this course, you're going to build a bunch of great applications along your journey to becoming an Android developer. First, you're going to learn the Kotlin basics. Then you're going to learn to build one app after another. And while you do that, you get a bunch of demos which will really dig deep into the concepts, as well as presentations which will help you to understand what you're learning. So don't miss out and get the course right now. You can find the link in the description below. Welcome back to the fourth part of the SQLite series, and in this video I would like to go over the main activity in which everything comes together. So everything that we prepared so far, the database handler, the model class and the item adapter, and of course all of the XML files, they come together in this main activity.kt file. So first of all, we of course have our onCreate. Then we have this button add set on click listener, which adds a new record. And then we have this setup list of data into recycler view. All right, let's look at this add record first. Add record is a function that I created in here. And what it has, it takes the name from the edit text. So it takes this name here, that one, from this edit text. Then it takes the email from this email edit text and puts them into variables. And then we have a database handler. This database handler is the object of the database handler class, which we created. So this one here. So we create an object of that class in order to access its functionality. All right, we pass in the context, because if we look at it, it needed a context when we wanted to create an object of it. So that's what we're doing here. We are passing in this. This is the context, which means this is our main activity. Then we check if those variables aren't empty. So those two edit fields, edit texts, they may not be empty, because if they are empty, then we will write a little toast saying name or email cannot be blank. Let's try it. Add record, and then name or email cannot be blank. Okay, so that is that. Now let's look what happens if it's not empty. So if we enter something into both edit texts, then we create this val status, which uses the add employee method of our database handler, so of our database handler class, and we pass in an object of emp model class 0 name email. So here, if we look at if we look at this method, it's easier like this. We will see that here it expects an emp or employee model class object, and then what it does is it inserts that entry into the table context. Okay, so it pretty much just adds it to the database. That's exactly what we wanted, right? Now you might wonder, because here it says 0. And 0, I told you about the ID, which is this primary key. It will be automatically incremented. So the thing is, even though I enter 0 here for employee model class, the system itself will take care of assigning the right ID. So this will automatically get the right ID because it will be automatically incremented. Okay, and we will see that in a second. We will see that actually on the device. Then we have the check here. If the status is greater than 0, then things worked out. Because I told you earlier, if the status was -1, then that means that we get an error, or that we have an error and something went wrong when trying to add something to the database. So if things went well, what we're going to do is just write a little toast here, saved, record saved for a long time, and displaying that. What I also do is I clear the two text fields, so the two edit texts. So once I enter something here, someone's email, and here it's Simone, so I wrote it incorrectly. But once I do that, you can see the two edit texts are cleared, and that is done by .clear, by this clear method. All right, and then we can see this setup list of data into recycler view again. So what is this method? Because we're using it twice, right? We used it already here in the onCreate method, and we do it once again once we stored something. So once we added a new entry. Well, now let's look at this function because it's used to show the list of inserted data. So it's pretty much updating the list that we see here at the bottom. So this list of all the entries that we have in our database. So we check, is there an entry in the database or not? And we do that by checking get items list. So let's check this out. Get items list gets an array list of employee model class. So we use our database handler and then we get the employee list. So what this will do is it will just return database handler view employee. Now, of course, you could sum that up because that's what the IDE tells me. So let me do that. It's a one-liner, so it's a little shorter. It got rid of the whole line. So here, basically, we're just returning the view employee. That's what this get items list function does. And view employee, as you might recall, it selects all employees from our table context. So it will return all the entries that we have in the database. Okay, so that's what get item list does. Let's go back to the function though. So to the setup list of data recycler view. So we checked, are there any entries? If there are some entries, then go into this code here. So then do something. If there are no entries, then go into this code. So let's look at this code because it's shorter first. So what happens is we say that the RV items list visibility is to set to view gone. What that means is that this RV items list, so basically this list here is made invisible. And instead, this text here, no records available, is set to visible. So TV, no records available, visibility, view visible. So I just want to indicate that there is no entry to the user if there is actually no entry. And we can see that once we delete all of those entries, we will see that this other text comes up. But before I do that, I want to show you the entries in the database actually. Okay, now let's look at this. We set the RV item list to visible. We made this other thing which says there is no entry to gone. So we make it invisible. And then we create a linear layout. And we create this item adapter, which gets the entries of our database via get items list. And then it puts them into the RV items list. So we're just filling the adapter with the data that we have from the database. And this is the method that is called just when we open up the application. So that's why it's called in the onCreate method here. And it's also called when we add another entry. It will also be called if we delete an entry. So add record, we looked at that already. Now let's look at update record dialog. And we can see here that what we're doing is we go and create a new dialog. And by the way, this is just going to create this dialog here. So edit, you can see update record. So it's basically creating this thing here. So we create a new dialog with a certain theme. So we have this style here, which I define theme overlay app compat dialog. So it has a certain width and height, so it doesn't take the full available height and so forth. So these are details, but let's look at this set cancelable. We set that to false. Then we set the content view to dialog update, and we looked at that before. It's this dialog here. Update record, name, edit text, and so forth. And then we set the text to whatever was in EMP model class. So that's why it's important that if we want to update something, we need to pass in the object that we want to edit. Then the same goes for our email ID. So basically what we're doing is when we click on edit, we want to know what we want to edit. So we want to populate the values here, the 0, and here this test UK. We want it to be an entry. Otherwise, we don't know what we are updating. That's why it's important to have it here. And that's exactly what we populate here with those two lines. So we are getting the value from the model, so from our object, and we are setting the text to our edit text update email ID. And it is within our update dialog, which is this object that we created of type dialog, which uses our layout dialog. All right. And then we create an set on click listener. So there are two buttons here. when we edit, the update button and the cancel button. So when we update, we take the names and the email, so those two entries, we take those two entries and we store them in variables. Then we create another object of our database handler. Here, create an object of it. And then we check if those values aren't empty. So what I'm doing here is not is empty, but you can sum it up to is not empty. So maybe that's a little better this way. So we say if the name is not empty and the email is not empty, because if one of them is empty, then we don't want to update it. So if both of them aren't empty, then call this method update employee and store the status, so if it worked or not, inside of this variable status. Of course, we need to pass in an EMP model class with the name and the email. Where do they come from? Well, they come from here. So the values that we put into these two fields. And then we of course also need to pass in an ID. So we're just taking the ID of the element that we wanted to edit anyway. So the ID of this record that we're currently updating. So in this case, let's say this is at ID 0, then this is the entry that we are editing. All right, and then if the status is greater than -1, we know that it worked. So we make a little toast here saying record updated. We update the list. So we update whatever we have here in this list here. And then we dismiss the update dialog. So we get rid of this dialog here, this one. Okay. And well, if we didn't fill both elements, so if we didn't fill both of those edit texts, then we get this toast here. And then what shall happen if we press cancel on this dialog? This button here, well, we just dismiss the dialog. And then of course, we may not forget to update dialog show, because we are preparing everything. Up to that point, up to here, that's where the preparation of the update dialog happens. And this is where it actually is appearing, or where it's actually shown. All right, and then the delete record dialog. So that's the dialog that pops up once we try to delete something. So this one here, are you sure you want to delete 0? So here you can see even in the text, it's using the name of the entry. And it can say no and yes. Now let's look at this. We create another builder. And that's something that we have done when we used alert dialogs. Maybe you can remember. If not, then check out the alert dialog video once again. So we use the builder, then we set the title, we set a message. So title, message, the icon, here set icon, and then we say what should happen if we press on the positive button. We give it a name or text, so we say yes here. And here we create another database handler object. We have the status again, so we check if deleting an employee, and specifically the employee that we are passing in, works. So what we're doing is we give in or pass in the ID of the employee model class object, and we set name and email to empty. Then we check the status again. So is the status not or greater than -1? Because then everything worked out. So we just let the user know, and we update the data into recycler view. So let's say we update this list here. So let me delete something. You can see this list here is updated, and that's due to this call here. Because if we don't call this, then the recycler view will not know that it has to be updated. And of course, once we click on something, we want to dismiss the dialog interface. And the same goes if we press no, then we also want to dismiss the dialog interface, dismiss. And then we need to, of course, create that alert dialog. We can set the cancelable to false or true. And then we finally show this alert dialog. Okay, so this is the code. Now let's look into how you can actually debug. So let's say you want to see all the entries in your database, because here I'm displaying them with a bunch of code. But what if you just want to see something on your database of the phone? What you can do is you can go to your build Gradle, and here it's important, go into the module app, and here inside of the dependency, so you need to scroll down a little bit. you go inside of the dependencies, and here you find this debug implementation, im.dno.dbinspector:3.4.1 at AAR. So that is what you need to enter there, because if you do so and you run the application, what will happen is you will find this application here. So let me drag this up. You will find this SQLite demo application, which looks like a little database icon. Okay, once again, it's this icon right here. Okay, when you open it, you will find some database entries. So on my device, I can see here comes SQLite demo databases employee database. So you can basically see it uses the folder entry data user 0. Nothing too fancy here. And then it uses the name of my package. So com SQLite demo /databases and then / the name of the database. And it's called employee database. So it's called like I have defined right here. So database name, that's what I've defined here. So if you want to see database name, where it's used, it's actually used up here. Okay, so that's what we're passing to the SQLite Open Helper. And then we set that to employee database. So employee database, and then we have this employee table. By the way, you can see that there is something that we didn't create ourselves, this Android _ metadata. So this is another one that is created, but that's not something that we have done. It's automatically there. But there is this version 1 that you can see here, employee data table v1 standing for database version 1. So whatever we entered here. And then there is this table called employee table. So that's exactly the name of the table that we have defined here. And now let's look at this table. So now you can see in this table, we have an underscore ID, and you can see there's 1, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 2, 3, 4, 5. They are all missing. So these are the ones that I have deleted. And then you can see at 0, or at 1 actually, at ID 1, you have the name 0 and the email test at test UK. Now let's look at our application once again. So let's move over, and you will see maybe it's a little small, but you can see here 0 test at test UK, then the entry 37, so name 3 and email 7, and then here's Simone at someone's email. Okay, so all of these entries are there. Now let's delete this one and say yes, and let's move over to our database connection. You can see suddenly it's gone. So it has been deleted off our database. So let's change this 3 to hello, for example. Let's move over, edit this 3 to hello, update, and now let's go over to the database tool, and you can see again here it says hello. So this is a way how you can debug your entries that you created in your database, in your SQL database. And yeah, now I think we made quite some progress, and you can use SQLite now. And it is a long process. There's a lot of stuff going on when using SQLite. But the thing is, once you have set it up and you went through the process once and then maybe a second time, it will really become natural after a while, because it really is the same structure over and over again. The only thing that changes are the table names, the columns that you want to have in there, and then at which point you want to make those entries. But that's pretty much it. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this little journey of just using SQLite. And I know it's been a long one, but no worries, it's going to be fine. We're going to go and use this, because then it will become a lot clearer once we use this in another real-world example. And we're going to use it actually in multiple real-world examples. So we're going to use it in the 7-minute workout app and also in the Happy Places app.
Alrighty, so you made it all the way to the end of the video. Thank you very much for still being with me. I'm very happy that you made it all the way through and that you learned something about SQLite. And I hope you can now use it to put it into your applications and apply it there and build even better apps. I wish you all the best on that journey. And of course, don't forget to check out my Android masterclass, because there you're going to learn how to build applications using exactly what you just learned and a lot more. So really, you will become a real Android developer. Okay, so thanks a lot for being with me once again. Don't forget to hit that like button if you haven't, and also that subscribe button, because we're uploading Android content once a week on Fridays. And also don't forget to check out one of those 2 videos here.